The shoulder girdle we constructed last time. The shoulder girdle consists of the clavicles and the scapulus, and they will be the basis from which we will hang our shoulder muscles and then the arms. From now on, we're going to call the shoulder muscles the deltoids. Here we'll get into a bit of anatomy jargon again, so if you're not up to snuff on your anatomy, you should open up your anatomy book. The deltoids are complex, but ultimately somewhat simple, or at least we can treat them somewhat simple in their interpretation. They consist of three main forms: the front, the middle, and the back. And there are some Latin terms here that we can use: anterior for the front, posterior for the back, and intermediate or acromial for the middle head of the deltoid. Acromial coming from the acromion process from which the middle head originates. The front deltoid is attached to the clavicle, the back is attached to the scapula, and the middle head is attached to the end of the clavicle, which is called the acromion process. And they all insert into the middle of the humerus or the upper arm bone at something called the deltoid tuberosity. And tuberosity just means like a bump on a bone, essentially. Because we have the shoulder girdle built and the armature for the arms as a representation of the arm bones, let's say, we can simply attach these forms where we know them to originate on the bones that we've established and aim them down towards the armature of the arms. There is another little finicky thing that we ought to know about the visual appearance of the deltoid. Because of the acromion process and the ball of the humerus, the upper part of the deltoid stretches over both of these. We have a much more square and angular aspect to the top portion of the deltoid muscle, usually about the top third of the overall height of the deltoid. The lower third being much softer and rounder in appearance, as you can see here. When we get to the side view, there are a couple of things to focus on specifically. We still need to continue working the contour, of course, but we do want to carefully respect the contour that's been built already. And when building new contours, make sure that we take a peek around the figure to make sure that the contours is placed at the correct depth. Essentially, that a contour that's meant to be a part of the abdomen doesn't end up being somewhere else, for example. This is rather typical. A contour that's meant to be somewhere ends up somewhere else from the side view, and we get this sort of awkward mess to sort out once we get back to the front view or the back view again. A typical one is that the contour of the scapula end up in the middle of the back. And the scapula is of course placed on either side of the center line in the back, so not in the middle. However, since we built them while dealing with our structure, we should be able to avoid this problem. We can always place our contours using the structure that we have set up already, and this is a huge advantage. Another thing to carefully consider here is how the contour in the front and the back connects to each other. What are the respective height differences between one part of the contour in the front compared to the back? Make sure that the ribcage can connect front to back. Make sure that the beginning of the contour of the buttocks are started in a place where they align properly with whatever part of the contour they should align with properly in the abdomen in the front, for example. And also that both of these contours, front and back, is placed well in relationship to the bony landmarks and structures that we spent so long setting up last time. Finally, you want to take time to make sure that the contours built from the front view is moving left to right from the side view correctly. The contours travel in depth, and this cannot be observed from one view. Only by turning the sculpture 90 degrees and observing the contour from the next view can they be observed in depth, by turning depth into left and right. A big one is the contour of the ribcage, which should travel at an angle heading back in space from the bottom of the ribcage towards the top, ending at the back of the armpit. If this doesn't happen, you will have no space later on for the side planes of the ribcage. You won't be able to build an armpit, and the front of the ribcage, primarily the pectoral muscle or chest muscles, will become very flat, long, and awkward looking. We use contours because they can be flexible. The contours need to be able to move, and the way to accomplish this task is to make sure that the contours sit proud on the surface or the volume of the forms below them. We will often describe the contours when they're being built as walls that sit above the volume of the forms below. Doing this allows you to cut them back easily if you need to without sacrificing work that's been done to a form below them. You won't erase notes and drawing this way, and you won't end up with giant flat spots by accident so easily either. This seems like a simple thing, but it's huge at this point in the process to make sure that the contours are sitting proud of the surface below them so that they are flexible and can be judged and changed very easily. This is also the best way to judge where the contours sit in space and not lose them in broad forms. Losing them can leave you with a figure that's a little boring looking and not as exciting as you would like it to be. You can consider flexible contours in sculpture as an analogy to working with a light hand when drawing in pencil on paper. You would always block in your work with a very light hand in pencil until you feel very certain about where it needs to be, and then you would dig in a little bit more. But in the beginning, you would always work with a light hand, and flexible contours is pretty much the same thing, just in sculpture. A lot of what I'm doing here I can do without reference because I'm used to it and I've been down this path many times before. I know to a certain extent the patterns of the body and I can recall anatomy and information because I've done this many times from reference before. If you are a beginner, do not underestimate the importance of having good reference and your anatomy books open while doing this. Without it, there's almost no way of getting a decent result if you haven't been down this path of sculpting the human figure many times before. The first episode can be done without too much reference, I think, but the second we start getting into contours and anything else that's visual, things get super complicated and there's a lot of anatomy to consider and deal with. We need to be smart and use reference whenever we have a hole in our knowledge as well. Representational art is a form of memory exercise, and like any exercise, you don't want to throw on 200 kilos on the bench press and go to town if you haven't worked out a lot before. You're bound to get injured or kill yourself. Do not be ashamed of using reference, as it is the best way to get someplace fast and the best way to train your memory and integrate the knowledge that we will need in order to make things like this mostly from imagination. And even I, having sculpted for years and years, had to pull up some reference from time to time while doing this, just to make sure I wasn't getting something horribly wrong. It's the #1 conversation I have with Patreon students. I ask them, where are your references? And the students who have reference and work from it, they progress much faster than the ones who do not.